A story that begins with compassion does not always end that way. In rural West Virginia, the Whittaker family became known to the world through documentary-style videos that exposed isolation, poverty, and generations of genetic complications. What began as awareness quickly evolved into attention. Attention became funding. Funding became controversy. And controversy became war. This is not about choosing sides. It is about understanding how a vulnerable family became the center of a digital storm involving accusations of fraud, fake illness claims, housing disputes, and retaliation threats between online creators. Because once money enters a story built on vulnerability, the narrative changes. And once accusations enter that narrative, the damage multiplies. The rise of visibility. The Whittaker family lived in obscurity for decades. Their home, described by journalists as severely deteriorated and unsafe, sat at the end of a rural road. Generations of intermarriage reportedly resulted in profound intellectual disabilities among several family members. For years, almost no one outside their immediate community knew their names. That changed when documentary filmmaker Mark Laita featured them on his channel, Soft White Underbelly. The videos went viral. Millions of viewers saw Ray, Lorraine, Betty, and Larry for the first time. Viewers reacted with shock, sadness, curiosity, and generosity. 2 public fundraisers were created to help the family with living expenses and, eventually, the possibility of a new home. Publicly documented totals show roughly $77,000 raised in an initial campaign, $55,000 raised for housing, nearly $130,000 in total donations. At first glance, that looks like a happy turning point, but reality is rarely cinematic. According to public statements made later by Laita, the funds did not accumulate toward a house. Instead, they were repeatedly withdrawn to cover emergencies, food shortages, transportation problems, medical needs, heating issues. Transfers were made directly to family accounts in West Virginia. Then came taxes. GoFundMe funds are considered taxable income to the account holder. Laita stated he paid the tax burden himself, reportedly around 37%. The public saw a large total raised. What they did not see was the constant outflow. That disconnect would become explosive. The viral accusation. Years later, YouTuber Tyler Oliveira released a video suggesting that the Whittakers were unaware of what happened to the funds raised on their behalf. In a brief exchange captured on camera, Betty Whittaker appeared confused when asked about the house fund. Clips circulated quickly. The implication was clear: money was raised. The house never materialized. The family seemed unaware. The internet did what it does best. It filled in the blanks. Accusations spread across comment sections and forums. Scam. Exploitation. Where did the money go? The narrative shifted from poverty to suspicion overnight. What many viewers did not know was that Oliveira had not conducted a full interview with Laita prior to publishing the piece. Laita later released documentation and recorded a phone call with Betty in which she acknowledged receiving money regularly, but said she did not understand it was specifically allocated toward a house. The difference between misunderstanding and fraud is enormous. Online, it barely matters. When creators turn on each other. What followed was not clarification. It was escalation. Other creators began entering the conflict. Some accused each other of misusing donations. Others accused critics of doxing, harassment, or false reporting. Names were mentioned. Real initials were shared. Claims of fake illness, fraud income, low-income housing violations, and illegal drug use were thrown into the public sphere. Threats of reporting to housing authorities and police departments were discussed. Copyright strikes were threatened. Cease and desist letters were mentioned. And through it all, the Whittaker family remained largely silent. This is the pattern of online conflict. A vulnerable subject becomes visible. Donations flow. Expectations rise. Outcomes fall short of cinematic hopes. Accusations emerge. Creators defend. Critics escalate. The original subject becomes secondary to the feud. At this stage, the story is no longer about help. It is about reputation. The illness allegations. One of the more serious claims to surface involved accusations that a creator fabricated or exaggerated a cancer diagnosis to solicit donations. This is a deeply inflammatory accusation. But here is what responsible reporting requires. No medical records have been publicly verified confirming or disproving such a claim. No formal criminal charges related to fraudulent illness claims have been documented in public court filings connected to this conflict. Allegations alone do not constitute proof. In digital conflicts, accusation often becomes shorthand for guilt. Documentary analysis requires more discipline. If a person falsely claims illness for financial gain, that is fraud. If a person discusses illness without clarity, that is confusion. If viewers donate based on emotion rather than verification, responsibility becomes diffused. None of that changes one core fact. Unverified claims repeated publicly can cause permanent harm. The housing controversy. Another point of escalation involved claims that a creator living in low-income housing was earning significant online income and therefore committing housing fraud. Again, allegations were made publicly. However, housing eligibility rules vary by jurisdiction. Income thresholds are calculated using specific formulas. Allegations of fraud require investigation by housing authorities, not YouTube channels. Encouraging mass reporting campaigns based on online disputes can cross into harassment territory. Documentary ethics require restraint, because if allegations are false, the damage is severe. And if allegations are true, they should be handled by appropriate authorities, not digital mobs. The psychology of digital outrage. The Whittaker story became viral because it was emotionally powerful. The conflict became viral because outrage is more powerful than compassion. Online audiences are conditioned to look for villains. Nuance is unsatisfying. Financial transparency is complicated. Emotional narratives are simple. When viewers saw a large fundraising total and no visible house, they experienced cognitive dissonance. Someone must be to blame. That instinct is understandable, but can also be weaponized. Creators gain views from controversy. Critics gain influence by exposing wrongdoing. Even well-intentioned participants can become trapped in escalation cycles. And when conflict becomes content, de-escalation becomes unprofitable. The quiet cost. For Mark Laita, the fallout reportedly led to stepping away from public fundraising for the Whittakers. For other creators, the conflict appears ongoing. For the Whittaker family, confidentiality laws surrounding adult protective services limit public updates. That silence frustrates audiences, but it may also protect vulnerable adults from further exploitation. The deeper question is not who won the online fight. It is whether public spectacle improved the family's long-term safety. There is no viral metric for that. What we can verify, as of the most recent documented public information, the Whittaker family members removed by Adult Protective Services remain under state supervision. Publicly accessible fundraiser totals match the amounts reported in creator statements. No publicly documented criminal convictions for fundraiser fraud involving the primary filmmaker have been confirmed. Allegations regarding illness fraud and housing violations remain claims unless proven by authorities. This is where responsible analysis stops, not because curiosity ends, but because documentation does. The structural problem. The Whittaker conflict reveals a broader issue in digital culture. Public charity without institutional oversight creates risk. When individuals raise funds for vulnerable subjects, accounting becomes personal. Transparency becomes discretionary. Misunderstanding becomes explosive. Reputation becomes fragile. Even when funds are transferred honestly, perception can collapse trust instantly. And once trust collapses, proof must work harder than accusation. The real question: was the family exploited? Possibly, by attention itself. Was money misused? Documentation suggests funds were transferred, but interpretation varies. Were accusations amplified beyond evidence? Undeniably. Did outrage generate more views than compassion? Yes. The Whittaker story began as a window into poverty and genetic isolation. It evolved into a case study in digital escalation. And the hardest truth may be this: the internet rarely knows how to stop once it starts. In the next part, we examine the deeper mechanics behind online donation controversies, how tax law, emergency spending, and misunderstanding create perfect conditions for scandal, and why even documented receipts are sometimes not enough to restore trust. Before we move forward, one question: when charity goes viral, who should be responsible for transparency? The creator, the platform, or the public? Comment your answer below. When money moves through the internet, it moves faster than understanding. The Whittaker controversy did not ignite because there were no receipts. It ignited because receipts alone cannot resolve a trust crisis once doubt has taken hold. To understand what happened, we have to separate three layers. What was raised? What was spent? What donors believed would happen? Those three layers did not stay aligned. And that misalignment is where conflict lives. The fundraising structure. Two public fundraisers were created to assist the Whittaker family. One primarily for immediate living expenses. One specifically labeled for purchasing a home. Public totals reflected approximately $130,000 raised across both efforts. That number became the anchor of outrage. To many viewers, $130,000 equals transformation. It equals a new house. It equals escape from poverty. But that assumption ignores the structure of emergency poverty. Poverty is not static. It is repetitive. It is urgent. It is unpredictable. When a family lives week to week, large sums do not sit untouched waiting for long-term goals. They are consumed by immediate crises, broken vehicles, medical issues, heating failures, overdue utilities. According to statements made by Mark Laita, funds were transferred repeatedly to cover those needs. Transfers ranged into thousands of dollars at a time. The pattern, as described publicly, was consistent. Donation inflow, emergency call, transfer outflow, balance drops. Repeat. This is not cinematic progress. It is survival maintenance. The tax complication. Here is where most viewers misunderstand how online fundraising works. When funds are raised through a personal GoFundMe account, the account holder may bear tax liability depending on how the funds are categorized and structured. If funds are not properly established as gifts to the beneficiary and instead flow through an individual's account, tax implications can arise. Public statements indicate that tax burdens were covered personally rather than passed on to the Whittaker family. If accurate, that adds complexity, not clarity, because tax payment is invisible to donors. Viewers see gross totals. They do not see net usable funds after taxation. This gap fuels suspicion. The expectation problem. The internet thrives on visible transformation. Before and after. Crumble house to new house. Chaos to stability. The Whittaker story did not produce that outcome. Instead, what the public saw was continued poverty. So the question shifted from "how can we help?" to where did the money go? That shift is psychologically predictable. Humans seek narrative closure. When closure does not arrive, suspicion fills the vacuum. But suspicion does not equal evidence. It equals discomfort. The Betty moment. In a viral video by Tyler Oliveira, a short exchange with Betty Whittaker suggested she did not recognize the house fund. That clip became the emotional trigger. To viewers unfamiliar with a broader financial pattern, it appeared damning. But short clips remove context. Later, in a recorded phone call released publicly, Betty acknowledged receiving money regularly, but stated she believed it was general assistance rather than a dedicated house fund. That distinction matters. It suggests misunderstanding, not necessarily deception. And misunderstanding is common in situations involving limited financial literacy, intellectual disability, informal support arrangements, lack of structured budgeting systems. However, online audiences rarely pause for complexity. They respond to the clip, not the context. The secondary escalation. Once the primary fundraising controversy gained traction, secondary conflicts emerged. Other creators entered the debate. Allegations expanded beyond the original issue. Claims surfaced involving fabricated illness narratives, improper housing eligibility, drug use monetization, doxing attempts, copyright retaliation. At this stage, the story no longer centered on the Whittakers. It centered on creator warfare, and warfare is profitable. Conflict drives engagement. Engagement drives revenue. Revenue drives continuation. The incentive structure is misaligned with resolution. The illness allegations, again. Accusations of fake illness are among the most explosive claims in online culture. But here is the disciplined position. No publicly verified court records confirm criminal fraud convictions connected to the illness claims being circulated in this dispute. That does not prove innocence. It does not prove guilt. It proves only that allegations must not be elevated to fact without documentation. The internet frequently collapses that distinction. Documentary integrity cannot. The housing allegations. Claims regarding low-income housing eligibility and online income levels require administrative investigation, not commentary speculation. Housing authorities operate on documented income declarations, benefit calculations, and compliance audits. Publicly inciting mass reporting based on online disputes risks crossing ethical boundaries. If wrongdoing exists, it belongs in formal review. If wrongdoing does not exist, public accusations cause irreversible harm. Again, the difference between suspicion and proof is structural, not emotional. The transparency trap. Why didn't detailed accounting exist publicly from the beginning? Because informal charity rarely begins with forensic accounting in mind. It begins with urgency. When creators step into helper roles without institutional frameworks, they assume responsibility without guardrails. That creates vulnerability. Vulnerability to misunderstanding. Vulnerability to poor record keeping. Vulnerability to reputational attack. Even if every dollar is transferred honestly, lack of proactive documentation invites doubt. And once doubt spreads virally, retroactive transparency feels defensive rather than clarifying. The outrage economy. The Whittaker conflict reflects a larger structural phenomenon. Outrage is monetizable. Calm documentation is not. When a video implies scandal, it spreads faster than a 45-minute breakdown of bank transfers. When a title suggests fraud, it outperforms a title explaining tax law. This is not a moral judgment. It is an algorithmic reality, and creators operate within that ecosystem whether they intend to or not. The psychological cost. For Mark Laita, public statements describe fatigue rather than fury. Repeated giving, repeated emergencies, repeated transfers, followed by public suspicion, creates emotional burnout. The most striking statement he made publicly was not defensive. It was exhausted. No one came to my defense. Whether viewers agree or disagree with his actions, that sentiment reflects a common phenomenon in public charity. The helper becomes accountable to an audience that did not share the operational burden. That imbalance breeds resentment, and resentment accelerates withdrawal. The family's position. The Whittakers themselves remain largely absent from the online debate. Adult Protective Services involvement limits transparency. Confidentiality laws exist to protect vulnerable adults. That protection frustrates online audiences seeking updates. But it may be necessary. The public wants narrative closure. The state prioritizes privacy. Those goals conflict. The structural failure. The deeper issue is not one creator versus another. It is the absence of institutional oversight in viral charity. When individuals become fund managers for vulnerable families, there is no automatic audit system. There is no third-party escrow requirement. There is no mandatory public ledger. There is no oversight body. Trust fills the gap, and trust is fragile. The moment it cracks, even documentation cannot fully restore it. The uncomfortable middle. It is possible that funds were transferred honestly. Emergencies consumed house savings. Communication was imperfect. Expectations were misaligned. Clips were selectively framed. Accusations escalated beyond evidence. Everyone involved believes they were right. These possibilities can coexist. Reality rarely belongs fully to one side. But social media demands winners and villains. So nuance disappears. The broader lesson. The Whittaker conflict is not an isolated event. It is a case study. When vulnerable people become viral subjects, three risks emerge. Exploitation by opportunists. Financial mismanagement due to lack of structure. Public backlash when expectations collapse. Even good intentions are not immune to these forces. The internet is not built for slow accountability. It is built for rapid reaction. In the next part, we examine the escalation phase, how copyright strikes, doxing threats, housing complaints, and legal warnings transform disagreement into digital warfare, and what that means for anyone who becomes publicly involved in helping vulnerable communities. Before we move on, answer this. Should large public fundraisers require independent third-party financial oversight by default? Comment your answer below. The moment a charity controversy becomes personal, it stops being about money. It becomes about territory, reputation, control of narrative. And once that shift happens, escalation is almost guaranteed. By the time the Whittaker dispute reached its third phase, it was no longer a disagreement over fund usage. It had evolved into a multi-channel conflict involving copyright threats, doxing accusations, housing complaints, illness allegations, and calls for platform reporting. This is the phase where online conflict stops being messy and starts becoming dangerous. The copyright weapon. In creator disputes, copyright is often the first tactical move. The rules are simple. If someone uses your footage without permission, you can file a copyright claim. Too many claims, and a channel risks strikes or removal. That power is legitimate when protecting original content. It becomes controversial when used during a feud. Once threats of copyright strikes are announced publicly, they signal something specific. This is no longer debate. This is enforcement. But enforcement in the middle of a public scandal often escalates tensions rather than resolving them. Because to audiences, copyright claims during controversy can look less like protection and more like retaliation. Whether justified or not, perception matters. And perception fuels the next wave. The doxing line. Accusations of doxing appeared during the conflict. claims that personal addresses or identifying information were shared or sought. Doxing, by definition, involves publicly exposing private personal data with harmful intent. In online disputes, even the suggestion of doxing raises stakes dramatically. Because once physical location enters the conversation, the risk shifts from reputational damage to personal safety. And that changes everything. What begins as commentary becomes a safety issue. Threats, even implied ones, can spiral. When someone says, "You have my information, I'm getting yours," that is no longer audience analysis. It is escalation language. And escalation language spreads fast. The housing allegations. One of the more serious claims that emerged involved allegations about low-income housing eligibility and reported income levels. This type of accusation is structurally different from a YouTube disagreement. Why? Because housing authorities operate under administrative law. False reporting can trigger audits. Investigations can affect someone's living status. Encouraging viewers to mass report someone to a housing authority transforms spectators into participants. That is a critical ethical threshold. If wrongdoing exists, it belongs in formal review channels. But weaponizing reporting as retaliation risks crossing from accountability into harassment. The internet rarely pauses to consider that difference. The illness narrative. Accusations of fabricated illness, specifically claims of false cancer narratives, intensify the dispute. Allegations of fake illness strike at moral identity. They imply manipulation of sympathy. They imply financial deception. They imply character fraud. But documentary discipline requires restraint. Publicly available verified court records do not confirm criminal convictions related to the specific illness fraud claims being circulated during this dispute. That does not confirm innocence. It confirms only this: allegation is not evidence. And in digital warfare, allegation spreads faster than verification. The reporting spiral. As tensions rose, both sides referenced reports filed with platforms. Platform reporting is built into the structure of YouTube and social media ecosystems. Users can report harassment, copyright infringement, fraud, hate speech, misrepresentation. In theory, reporting protects community standards. In practice, during disputes, reporting becomes leverage. Each side claims the other is violating rules. Each side gathers screenshots. Each side builds a case. The conflict becomes procedural rather than conversational. And once procedural escalation begins, reconciliation becomes unlikely. The psychology of retaliation. Digital conflict often follows a predictable pattern. Initial accusation, defensive clarification, counteraccusation, personal exposure, reporting threats, legal language, entrenchment. By phase 3, participants no longer aim to persuade each other. They aim to neutralize each other. Neutralization can take many forms. Platform removal, audience shift, legal pressure, reputation erosion. At this stage, even truth becomes secondary to survival. The audience effect. The most powerful force in digital warfare is not the creators. It is the audience. When viewers pick sides, they amplify. Comments escalate language. Supporters pressure creators to respond. Silence is interpreted as guilt. Calm is interpreted as weakness. The crowd becomes oxygen. Without audience engagement, most conflicts would collapse. But engagement sustains them. And outrage is high engagement fuel. The vulnerable center. Lost in all of this. The Whittaker family. When creators fight over narrative control, the original vulnerable subjects become secondary. Every allegation, whether about money, illness, housing, or reporting, pulls attention away from the family's current safety, adult protective services involvement, long-term stability, medical care, legal oversight. Conflict is louder than care, and loudness wins the algorithm. The legal shadow, language such as cease and desist, pressing charges, and fraud began appearing publicly. These terms carry weight, but most online disputes never reach formal litigation. Why? Because litigation requires evidence thresholds, filing fees, attorneys, time, court schedules. Online escalation is cheaper and faster. It is also riskier. Public threats of legal action can backfire if unsupported. At the same time, defamation laws are complex. Calling someone a criminal without proof can itself create liability. Digital warfare often ignores this. Documentary clarity cannot. The reputation economy. The core asset in online creation is reputation. Subscribers are trust indicators. Views are credibility currency. Audience loyalty is economic survival. When reputation is attacked, creators respond with urgency. That urgency can cloud judgment. The Whittaker controversy exposed something broader. Reputation online can be shredded in days. Rebuilding it takes months or years. And sometimes it never fully recovers, even if documentation supports the defense. Because first impressions linger longer than corrections. The boundary question. One statement from Mark Laita stands out in public response. This is not a helping channel. That sentence signals a boundary shift. When creators blur lines between journalism, documentary, and charity, expectations multiply. Audiences expect emotional involvement, financial accountability, long-term commitment, personal responsibility. But creators are not institutions. They are individuals operating in public. Without structural boundaries, good intentions become liabilities. The Whittaker conflict may mark a turning point in how creators approach public charity. Private help avoids spectacle. Public help invites scrutiny. And scrutiny can become attack. The uncomfortable reality. It is possible that some accusations were exaggerated. Some communication was unclear. Some responses were emotionally charged. Some escalation was avoidable. Some harm was unintentional. In digital warfare, few conflicts are entirely one-sided. But once both sides feel wronged, compromise fades. The conflict sustains itself. The ethical core. There is one question that remains larger than the personalities involved. What responsibility do creators have when they become financial intermediaries for vulnerable families? And what responsibility do audiences have before amplifying scandal? Outrage feels righteous. Documentation feels boring. But documentation protects truth. In the next part, we step away from the personalities entirely. We examine the structural problem. What happens when viral empathy meets unregulated charity, and whether a better model could prevent this kind of collapse in the future. Before we move on, answer this. When online disputes escalate to personal threats and reporting campaigns, should platforms intervene earlier or stay neutral? Comment your answer below. When the noise quiets, one truth remains. The real failure did not begin with YouTube. It began long before cameras, fundraisers, or accusations. The Whittaker family lived for decades in isolation, in poverty, in genetic hardship, in collapsing housing conditions that should have triggered intervention long before the internet ever arrived. By the time creators began filming, the system had already been absent. No consistent oversight, no sustained social support, no structured financial management, no long-term case supervision strong enough to prevent crisis. So when money finally appeared, it entered a space without guardrails. When attention arrived, it landed on a family unprotected from exposure. And when conflict erupted, there was no neutral institution stepping in to mediate. The lesson here is uncomfortable. Viral compassion cannot replace structured care, and online accountability cannot substitute for formal oversight. If a family requires long-term protection, that protection must come from systems designed for it, not from creators, not from comment sections, not from crowd emotion. Because without structure, even help can collapse into harm. What matters now isn't who won the argument. It's whether the family at the center is finally safer than before. After the accusations, after the live streams, after the copyright threats, and police reports and donation debates, what actually changes? That's the question nobody asks once the drama cycle ends. Because scandals burn hot, but they burn fast. The internet moves on. The Whittakers don't. Betty and Larry still wake up every day in the same reality. Ray, Timmy, and Lorraine are still under protective placement. The legal questions surrounding money and exploitation are still matters of record, not comment sections. What fades is outrage. What remains is consequence. This scandal exposed something larger than one creator or one accusation. It exposed how fragile, vulnerable families become when attention replaces infrastructure. A camera can document hardship. A fundraiser can ease a crisis. But neither can replace long-term guardianship, case management, or stable oversight. And here is the hardest truth of all. The public often demands villains because villains make stories simple. But exploitation cases are rarely simple. Sometimes money is mismanaged without malicious intent. Sometimes accusations are exaggerated for clicks. Sometimes both things happen at once. And in the middle of that chaos are people who cannot advocate for themselves. That's why this cannot become a spectator sport. No doxing, no harassment, no playing detective with housing records, no weaponizing illness claims for revenge. If fraud occurred, that is for law enforcement to establish. If false accusations were made, that too has legal pathways. The responsible position is uncomfortable but necessary. Follow verified filings. Ignore rumor. Refuse to amplify threats. Protect the vulnerable first. Because once the views drop and the creators move on to their next headline, the Whittakers will still be there, living with whatever consequences this wave of attention leaves behind. So now the real question. After everything that has surfaced, who do you believe needs accountability the most? And more importantly, how do we make sure the family at the center is never turned into content collateral again? Comment below, but keep it factual, respectful, and focused on protection, not punishment. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.